Sarah had always been interested in the old mansion on the outskirts of the tiny town. It had been standing there for generations, its tall, weathered edifice with its gloomy windows looking out at the world like a silent observer. Years had passed since its previous owners, who had left no evidence of their presence, had abandoned it. Yet Sarah and her husband knew this was the house they wanted to call home when they made the decision to relocate to the town. Sarah's heart was beating fast as they walked into the house. Her nose were flooded with the musty aroma of dust and aged wood, and she had a chill down her spine. Her eyes were wide with astonishment as she peered around the living room. Despite the heavy curtains that covered the windows, the room was large and light-filled. Although the furniture was dated and creaky, Sarah liked the charm it offered. Sarah's husband grew more and more enthusiastic as they looked around the house. He flung open every door and peeked into every space, admiring the home's rich history and allure. Sarah was focused on the attic, though. She experienced an unexplainable sense of anticipation as she ascended the steep stairs. When she ascended the stairs, she noticed a dust and cobweb-covered, ancient trunk resting in the corner. She walked over to the trunk and opened it, displaying a variety of vintage clothing and other misplaced possessions. And then she noticed it, a vintage doll. It was perched on top of the clothing and staring up at her with a porcelain face. As she lifted it up, Sarah experienced a strange discomfort, yet she was unable to dispute its beauty. The doll's outfit was made of beautiful lace, and it had long, curling hair. Sarah brought it down with her since she thought it would look great in the living room. She experienced an odd sensation as she set the doll on the mantelpiece, as if the doll were watching her. She brushed off the sensation as being in her head and continued with her day. Yet, as night passed and the home became quieter, Sarah began to hear odd noises. Despite the fact that her husband was sound asleep, she heard footsteps on the stairs. Even though no one was in the corridor, she overheard whispering. She suddenly noticed the doll moving, even though it simply twitched its head. That tiny action was enough to chill Sarah to the bone. She made an effort to tell herself that it was all in her head, but she was unable to get rid of the feeling that something was wrong. Sarah experienced a feeling of dread as she slept that night. She came to the realization that the old house wasn't as tranquil and quiet as she had imagined, and that there was something peculiar about it. She was aware that she would have to deal with whatever was haunting the house as she closed her eyes and fell asleep. The ancient doll Sarah had discovered in the attic gave Sarah the uneasy feeling that something was amiss. She didn't know why, but every time she glanced at it, she got the creeps. But when she voiced her worries to her husband, he rejected them as being in her head. "Sarah, it's just a doll," he said. "It is safe for you." Sarah, though, sensed a problem. Little details like the doll's eyes tracking her as she walked by it caught her attention. Then she noticed it moving once more. She was certain that it wasn't her imagination this time. After turning its head to gaze at her, the doll quickly returned to its former position, acting as though nothing had happened. Sarah made an effort to put the doll out of her mind and concentrate on other things, but it persisted. Then the odd things started happening. Doors opened and closed on their own, and Sarah heard strange noises throughout the entire house. Although she made an effort to justify them, she realized something wasn't right. Sarah made the choice to confront the doll one evening. She approached it and gazed upon its porcelain face. She had the strangest feeling that the doll was looking back at her with lifeless eyes. Then she noticed it moving once more. The doll's arm twitched this time, as if it were about to reach out and seize her. With her heart beating, Sarah shouted and ran away. She was aware that she had to stop ignoring the doll. That had to go, she had to do it. But she discovered that she was unable to discard it when she attempted. Every time she attempted to get rid of it, a setback would occur. She would become distracted when the doll would move or when someone would knock on the door. Sarah began to experience symptoms of mental instability. She was unable to describe what was happening, and her husband didn't think she was telling the truth. But later, in the attic, she discovered the diary. It belonged to the home's former owner and made reference to a doll with a curse that was kept in the attic. Sarah came to the conclusion that the doll was cursed and was to blame for the odd occurrences taking place in the home. She was aware that whatever it took, she had to get rid of the doll. But as she continued to stare at the doll, she noticed that it was daring her to attempt by staring back at her. And Sarah was aware that a battle lay ahead. Sarah was aware that the old doll she kept in her home was cursed and was to blame for the odd occurrences. Though she was unable to articulate how or why, she was aware that she needed to get rid of it right away to prevent more damage. The doll was indestructible despite her best efforts to destroy it. Even after her best efforts, it kept coming back. The doll then started to harm her. When Sarah would awaken from a nap with scratches on her arms and legs, she knew the doll was to blame. Sarah turned to the local specialist in the paranormal in her desperation for a solution. She knew he was the only person who could assist her because she had heard about him from some of the other town residents. After scheduling a meeting, she went to visit him and told him all that had occurred. The expert nodded carefully while paying close attention to Sarah's story. He talked in a low voice once she was done and caressed his beard. He declared, "The doll is cursed. Someone who wished to get even with its owner cursed it. The doll now has a life of its own thanks to the curse, and it will do anything to hurt anyone who stands in its way." The comments of the expert made Sarah shudder. She was aware of the danger she was in and the need to find a means to reverse the curse. "What can I do?" she inquired. The specialist leaned in closer and cast a sharp gaze at her. "The curse can only be broken in one way," he said. "In order to free the deceased from the doll's curse, you must locate their remains and carry out a ceremony on them. The doll can only be stopped by doing this. It won't be simple." Sarah experienced a mixture of relief and terror. Although she was glad that the doll's curse might be lifted, she was aware that it would be challenging to track down the person who cast the spell. But she vowed to give it a shot. She left the expert's home after saying her thanks, her thoughts whirling with possibilities. Sarah had a sense of direction as she made her way home. No matter what it took, she had to track out the remains of the person who had cursed the doll. She was committed to stopping the doll and permanently ending the curse. She was aware that time was of the essence and that the doll would do everything to hurt her. She had to move quickly. Sarah was aware that she had to locate the skeleton of the person who had cursed the doll, but she wasn't sure of how to go about it. She looked over the diary she had discovered in the attic in the hopes of finding a hint, but it was obscure and nebulous. She was aware that she had to continue looking despite all obstacles. She went up into the attic with her husband in quest of any hints that would point them in the direction of the remains. Sarah grew uneasy as they combed through the worn-out trunks and boxes. She was aware that the doll was keeping an eye on her and awaiting the ideal opportunity to attack. Then it took place. They were attacked by the doll, who scratched Sarah's arm after bursting out from behind the box. When her husband attempted to seize the doll, it slipped from his hands and fled. Sarah was aware that they had to do whatever it took to get the doll. The doll was nowhere to be discovered despite their thorough search of the premises. They looked in every room, every nook and cranny, but it was gone. Sarah experienced feelings of annoyance and dread. She was aware that the doll was still around and waiting for an appropriate opportunity to retaliate. In an effort to catch any misinformation, she made the decision to read the diary again. She reread it and found a brief allusion to a secret area in the attic. She was aware that they had to do whatever it needed to find it. Once more, they looked through the attic for any indications of a secret compartment. Then they discovered it. A tiny door concealed behind a stack of used clothing. As soon as they opened the door, a musty scent enveloped them. As they entered, they discovered a small room packed with antique furniture and crates. When Sarah scanned the space for any indication of the remains, her heart began to race. Then she noticed it. Hidden behind a stack of ancient books was a little box. A tiny bag was inside the package when she cracked it open. When she opened the bag, she discovered the doll's crucier's remains. No matter what it took, Sarah knew she had to carry out the ceremony in order to lift the curse. Her heart was pounding with eagerness as she took the leftovers and left the room. She was aware that the doll would use all of its might to thwart her efforts. But she was determined to end the curse once and for all. No matter what it took, Sarah knew she had to carry out the ceremony to remove the curse from the old doll. As soon as she saw the doll's crucier's remains, she realized she had to use them to free the doll from its enchantment. She assembled the required materials and set up a spot in the living room as her husband and she got ready for the ceremony. Sarah collected the remains and started to repeat the incantation while they lighted candles and incense. She felt a sensation of power going through her as she said the lines. She was aware that by freeing the victim from the curse, the doll's influence over her would end. After that, an odd thing happened. The doll started moving. It began to move on its own as its porcelain face twisted into a furious posture. From the mantelpiece, it jumped and began to assault Sarah and her husband. They attempted to avoid it, but it moved too quickly. In an effort to prevent them from carrying out the ceremony, it nipped and scratched at them. Sarah experienced a mixture of terror and resolve. No matter what it took, she had to complete the ceremony. The power grew greater as she continued to speak the incantation through her. After that, an odd thing happened. The doll began to alter. Its limbs twisted and bowed strangely, and its porcelain face began to fracture. It sent forth a spine-tingling cry before shattering into a million fragments. The doll was no longer because the spell had been lifted. Sarah's husband and she exchanged startled glances. They were unable to accept what had just occurred. They had overcome the curse and prevailed. They were aware of how the encounter had altered them and that they would never forget what had taken place in that old mansion. Sarah realized she had learned something significant as they walked out the door and headed to the car. She had discovered that there were certain things in the world that were inexplicable and that sometimes facing your anxieties head-on helped you to get over it. She was aware that the doll would always be a part of her life and that she would never forget it. She was aware that the curse had been broken and that this had made her stronger.